I must admit I kinda like DreamWorks' 2002 animated feature, Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarrion. Released awkwardly between Shreks, Spirit is a Western drama notable for having the corniest soundtrack of all time. I picked this movie because I thought it would be easy to make fun of. And once again, like every decision I have ever made in my life, I was wrong. This movie is about a feral American horse called a Mustang who is repeatedly rounded up and slowly loses the will to resist his human captors. If it weren't for the addition of Matt Damon and Bryan Adams, it'd probably be an alright movie. It'd still be corny as hell, but I kinda like corny stuff. Mustangs originally descended from the horses of Spanish explorers, so a Cimarron horse is a feral horse of Spanish origin. Cimarron translates to wild or untamed from Spanish, roughly, hence the title of the movie. So Matt Damon plays a Kiger Mustang with meticulously sculpted eyebrows that presumably lives somewhere in the Yellowstone area. You'd never find a Kiger outside of southeastern Oregon, but, you know, it's a pretty minimal complaint. One night the Mustang leaves his ideal home to investigate some sleeping wranglers and ends up being wrangled. The wranglers ultimately decide that the Mustang is too wild for them and they sell him to the cavalry that appears to be stationed in Monument Valley. Monument Valley is in southern Utah and really has no reason to be in this film except for its iconic nature in westerns. I think that's fair enough. The movie is a surprising mixture of tribute to the history of the actual West as well as to western movies themselves. It doesn't claim to be based on a true story, so that does ultimately save it from a lot of my ire. There was never any army base in Monument Valley in reality, so we'll just call this Nickelodeon's Burbank Studios. The cavalry immediately attempt to break the horse rodeo style. It's a cartoonish exaggeration, but once again has some roots in reality. Some rodeo sports themselves have origins from less humane practices still in use in many places today. The term breaking a horse means training a horse to be ridden, and it comes from a time when this was done by breaking the horse's spirit. You know, literally destroying its will to resist.
The old philosophy was force, fear, intimidation, repetition. You make them do it against their will. They hated it. Too bad. We forced them. You made a slave out of the horse, and a lot of horses, even today, are slaves.
Aside from the officers, most cavalrymen were usually recent immigrants to the US. A fact this movie does not represent at all. Aside from two officers, Colonel and Murph, the cavalry is pretty devoid of character and none of them appear to be speaking with funny accents.
Sergeant!
Yes, sir.
Tie this horse to the post. No food or water. 3 days.
Yes, sir.
If you tie a horse up for 3 days without water in the Utah desert, it will die. I think a big part of why this movie failed to be very memorable is because it falls back on tropes that had already been worn out a decade earlier. The result is a bland movie about 7 years out of place. I like the horse parts, but the human parts are just so... it just leaves so much to be desired. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Crow are tribes that would be found much further north from here. Monument Valley is on Navajo land. That being said, this, along from this line from Curly Mustache Guy, tell us a lot.
Incoming patrol reports hostiles headed north.
Ah.
The railroad has expressed concern, sir. They've requested additional patrols.
Between 1874 and 1876, the 7th Cavalry under command of Colonel Custer protected the Northern Pacific Railway in Dakota and Montana Territory. It also allows us to date this movie to 1874. The railway slipped into bankruptcy in 1875, and construction would not begin again until 1877, by which point Custer would be dead. That's just assuming that they have accuracy for dates, but they already don't care much for locations. This movie is really spatially confused, but hey, whatever. This is my video. And I'm saying it's 1874. And yes, I'm saying this guy is probably Colonel Custer. And yes, this man is explicitly a Lakota Sioux. So you see why this is a little bit harder to make fun of than originally anticipated. Despite the fact that it should be dead, the Mustang still refuses to be ridden and is saved from certain death by Little Creek. He is then captured again and taken to a different corral. Little Creek goes in the opposite route. He tries to tame the Mustang through affection and persistence instead of force and fear. This ultimately fails as well, as the Mustang is a cartoon character, and Little Creek sets him free. Unfortunately, he makes it just in time to watch the cavalry leading a charge into the village. In 1874, the Lakota were still in the Black Hills. This does appear to be the Black Hills. In 1874, the government did send the Custer expedition to the area, but no military engagement took place. Custer did take a newspaper reporter with him, however, who leaked to the presses that there was gold in the Black Hills. This resulted in a rush of white settlers trespassing on Sioux land. George Armstrong Custer had graduated at the bottom of his class from West Point, but distinguished himself in service during the Civil War. His claim to fame was his incredible luck and his ability to lead cavalry charges into Confederate troops. The general game plan was to charge in, round up as many women, children, and non-combatants as possible, and force the warriors to surrender. The idea was to subdue and move the natives to reservations, but there were plenty of times where the army had orders to essentially kill all males of fighting age and round up the women and children. Considering that the women and children immediately flee across the river and Custer follows in pursuit, that seems to be what is happening here as well, so that's a nice detail there. Rain, the girl horse and de facto love interest, is injured and the Mustang is once again captured and led away to a train. This is unusual, as the army would usually shoot all captured Indian ponies. We endure another Bryan Adams song before learning that the reason that the horses did not get shot is because the railroad plans on working them to death. This culminates in an incredibly epic scene of the Mustang running down the side of a mountain while a steam engine train rolls after him. Hans Zimmer did the not Bryan Adams part of the soundtrack, and it is some really enjoyable work. This segment with just the animation and his music pulling the train up the mountain and then the run down the mountain, best part of the movie in my opinion. Everyone knows only a train can stop another train, so it's a good thing that there is another one at the foot of the mountain. Unfortunately, this sets off an explosion that totals the railroad's base camp and sets the entire forest on fire. Yeah, I'm starting to see why the railroad went bankrupt the following year. The Mustang is almost strangled, but is rescued at the last moment by Little Creek. No reunion is complete without the whole gang, however. And look at that, they're all here. A chase scene ensues in what looks like a hybrid of the Grand Canyon and Bryce Canyon, although we are presumably still somewhere in Montana, Dakota territory. This concludes with the Mustang leaping the canyon from atop a butte.
Flying? There were times I believed I could.
This final desperate act ultimately wins the respect of the Colonel, and he lets Little Creek and the Mustang go free. The Mustang takes Little Creek home, is reunited with Rain, and our protagonist finally receives a name.
Spirit, who could not be broken.
And that's Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarrion. It's alright for what it is, and compared to Anastasia or Balto, it follows history much more closely. Hans Zimmer's music is really enjoyable, and Homeland and Iron Horse Camp Pulling are especially notable. Matt Damon's narration is totally unnecessary, and I wish it wasn't there. But it also gives the movie kind of a Black Beauty feel. I do not know if that was intended or not, probably not, but you know, whatever makes Matt Damon more tolerable. It is definitely pretty jarring when the horses switch from hand-drawn models to CGI models. That hasn't aged well, and honestly a lot of this movie makes me wonder if it was rushed out of production. Other than the CGI models, it does have a strangely kind of timeless feel to it. If you like horses and Bryan Adams and Matt Damon, then this is probably the best movie for you in the entire world. But I would be lying if I told you that the music and narration didn't make me cringe from time to time. When gold was rumored to be in the Black Hills, the U.S. sent in the previous Custer expedition I had mentioned. Attempts were made to purchase the land, but the U.S. offered the Sioux a tenth of the asking price. By spring 1876, 10,000 natives had joined in a camp along Little Bighorn River for the summer bison hunt, and in defiance of government orders to return to their reservations or risk being attacked. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Custer drew near the camp and, realizing that the natives would soon be aware of his presence if they weren't already, decided to press on ahead rather than wait for reinforcements or do extra reconnaissance. He'd never encountered natives that didn't run from the cavalry and had no idea how big the camp on the river was. He had not taken into account that many had left the reservations in order to participate in the summer bison hunt. Assuming the natives would flee from his forces, he split his cavalry into two groups. One command under himself and one under Marcus Reno. He sent Reno down to the south end of the encampment and took his forces up to the northern end, convinced the natives would flee from Reno's forces. In a classic case of biting off more than one can chew, the hunter quickly became the hunted. While Reno and most of his men were able to escape, Custer, his entire command, and all civilians with him were famously wiped out. Since this time, perpetual debate has occurred over whose fault the Battle of Little Bighorn is. Nowadays, most people generally blame Custer for failing to do more recon on his enemy. In the past, blame immediately fell with Reno and his command for retreating instead of rushing to Custer's aid, and he later died a broken man. But these answers also fail to give proper credit to the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho who fought Custer that day. Indeed, it appears the Sioux leader Sitting Bull had just had a vision of a great victory over soldiers during a sun dance that he related to his people shortly before the battle. The natives were well organized, well equipped, endowed with a sense of righteous anger, and had a significant boost in morale due to Sitting Bull's vision. Custer had had legendary luck all of his life, but it seems it finally deserted him in the face of Sitting Bull's powerful medicine. Government response was swift, and by May of the following year, the Great Sioux War had ended. The Sioux were still unwilling to cede the Black Hills, however, so the U.S. government hit them with a sell or starve ultimatum. The reservations the natives were forced onto didn't have adequate resources to feed all the transplants, and the U.S. government had to supply rations to the reservations. Under threat of forced starvation, the Sioux ceded the Black Hills to the U.S. government. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been taken without just compensation and offered the Sioux over $1 billion. The Sioux have refused to take the money, as acceptance would legally terminate the Sioux's demand for the return of the Black Hills. Custer's last stand and the brutal response of the U.S. government generally marks the beginning of the end of the Old West in the minds of the American public. By 1890, the U.S. Census would declare the frontier broken up. Destiny had apparently been manifested. The Mustangs' numbers have dropped significantly since then, from around 3 million individuals to about 100,000, including horses and holding facilities. Mustangs' numbers were significantly reduced by people hunting them for dog food. Laws were eventually passed in the 1980s to protect wild horses and burros. Now the problem they face is that there's too many horses and not enough land, because all of our land is full with cows, and, well, Americans themselves don't eat horse meat, but that apparently doesn't apply to our pets. Essentially, it's all downhill from here for all of these characters. I mean, this one only has 2 years left to live. And in case you doubt that he is indeed Custer, well, I have a quote from the screenwriter John Fusco. The Colonel is really Custer and was called Custer in my early drafts, and we portrayed the Washington River Massacre. So, I wasn't trying to portray the 7th Cavalry as good guys. Let's portray Custer and the 7th as they were, and the Native American stuff I portrayed not so lily white. I spent a lot of time in the Lakota world. I speak the language and was adopted into a family there. So I showed other Native American characters who were more brutal with the horses because that existed too. It was a real survival world and I wanted to get all of that stuff. There are many more gray areas in the original. But as it found its way, it became what it wanted to be, and I'm not gonna argue animation with Jeffrey. It's ultimately gonna reach young people and maybe light a fuse for them to get interested in the West. Interestingly enough, Katzenberg was the same man who insisted that Pocahontas be less historically accurate in order to have wider audience appeal as well. So I guess we've all learned that we should probably just not let Jeffrey Katzenberg make movies about Native Americans. But I think Katzenberg's recommendations are ultimately for the best in this case. Because there was no Washington River Massacre. There was the Battle at Washita River, sometimes called the Washita River Massacre. You see, I've been able to praise this film for its relative historical accuracy this entire time because it decided to ditch real history at some point. If this was actually about the Washita Massacre and all of the events leading up to it, I'd be able to compare it to the real history of the world week by week. But because they ditched the based on a true story narrative, and because it's about a horse, I actually have a soft spot for this movie. Ultimately, Spirit relies too heavily on cliches without taking enough risks to be a really great or memorable movie. It's not that things being cliched or corny make them inherently bad. Every story ever made can be broken down into cliches. There's entire websites dedicated to it. As Umberto Eco states in his 1985 essay on Casablanca, 2 cliches make us laugh, but 100 cliches move us because we sense dimly that the cliches are talking among themselves and celebrating a reunion. Just as extreme pain meets sensual pleasure and extreme perversion borders on mystical energy, so does extreme banality allow us to catch a glimpse of the sublime. I do feel like sitting through this whole movie is worth it for the reveal of the character's name, unless you really hate the soundtrack. It almost feels like this whole movie was written in reverse just to eventually have the line be delivered. Outside of historical accuracy, that's where it fails plot-wise. Custer's kinda made out to be some villain, which is fair enough, but the man is such a character, and again it would have added some desperately needed flavor to this. Lots of loving character details put into the background horses, giving them surprisingly complex personalities. Lots of detail is put into the background Sioux characters. Many of the white characters and cavalrymen are copy and pasted, and a lot of them are CGI. It's like I said before, it looks like it was rushed out of production. It just makes the movie more faceless and bland. Detailed animations of background characters at the Iron Horse Camp or any sort of unique traits at all outside of different facial hair for the cavalrymen would have been really great. Maybe these things were a deliberate choice, I don't know. I'm not going to complain about the cavalry or westward expansion being vilified because that's fair enough. But I am going to complain about having boring, faceless villains. The problem with deifying the Lakota like this is that it essentially erases their unique identity as a people. This whitewashed version of the West, in turn, erases reality from the mind, because it is very unmemorable. We end up with kind of a literal blank space in our perception of history. It robs the identity away from unique people altogether when they choose to represent them in, as Fusco said, the most lily-white way possible. Romanticizing history in such a non-offensive way actually tends to make it less memorable and less significant to people generations down the line. I suppose it's ultimately a man versus nature story, except that nature, embodied by spirit, triumphs, and we're supposed to be happy about that. Using a feral Spanish horse to embody untamed American wilderness is a bit of a questionable choice. This is likely due to the 1995 PBS Nature episode Cloud, Wild Stallion of the Rockies. That explains the title of the movie, but as for the plot, well, one of the foundational myths of American culture is called the frontier thesis. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner posited that what made the American character unique from our European counterparts was that our successive generations of moving out onto the frontier had shaped our psyche. By conquering nature, we spread American culture to uncivilized lands, which affected the culture and character of Americans in turn. But this theory doesn't hold much water today, as it implies the frontier was uncivilized land to begin with, and that Europeans are inherently America's counterpart. But still, it is one of the major reasons why we revere the Wild West as iconic Americana. If the frontier shaped the American character, it was probably due to centuries of warfare with the people who already lived there, not due to the effects of civilizing untamed lands. The frontier theory itself didn't come around until after the end of the frontier, so it inherently romanticized the past to begin with. Ultimately, this movie subverts frontier thesis, but in a very lukewarm way, by romanticizing the past before the white settlers arrived, but only very half-heartedly. I also feel like romanticizing the past in any capacity to begin with does not subvert frontier thesis at all, because it still gives us an incorrect perception of history. Misrepresenting or sanitizing history to capitalize on it comes with the added risk of reinforcing incorrect identities in the present. And don't be fooled, despite its time period and somewhat timeless feel, this movie is definitely a product of the early 2000s attitudes and ideas. This movie steals the uniqueness of the Lakota away and ultimately uses them for what is most likely a soulless Oscar grab. I feel like this is likely another attempt by Jeffrey Katzenberg to snag an Oscar for animated best film by covering a dark topic that doesn't really make a good children's movie. He has a tendency to do that. I still like it as a story about a particular character overcoming adversity, however. The knowledge that life is all downhill, though, for all of these characters, does leave you feeling kinda hollow inside. And that, in a strange way, ultimately does subvert frontier thesis better than the movie proper ever could. But it's like I said, I enjoy this film for what it's worth, and I really love the artwork. Most of the artwork. Maybe stop making children's movies about the conflicts between indigenous people and white colonizers. I'm not opposed to making animated movies about such a subject, but maybe don't make it an animated movie for kids. Some subjects are just not good for children's films. If you're going to adapt a story about overcoming the legacy of war, genocide, and colonization for kids, make it instead about evil, technologically superior aliens who colonize different worlds and use up all of the available resources, thereby destroying the primitive, but good native population in the process. But it turns out the colonizers actually aren't that evil, they're just emotionally dysfunctional and constantly facing resource shortages. So see, people do dark and highly controversial subject matter with children's media all the time. You just need to do it in a creative and metaphorical way.
Sure, all these places have been explored before, but they haven't been recorded so intimately as they have been in this journal. It makes them new and special all over again for any reader to experience.
Well, Mr. Fusco, it's been a long time coming, but hopefully this video will ignite the interest of more to the history of the American West. I hope you liked this video. I had to cut an insane amount of stuff from this. There was just so much information about history and horses. I encourage you to get into long, drawn-out arguments about what I should do with my channel in the comments below, as that really boosts activity on my videos. So just go ahead and fight. Alright, bye.
Confession. With you, I feel a connection. With you, it's like an infection. I've been infected with an obsession. With you, never any tension. Nothing but love and affection. Enough of my case, so let's cut to the chase. Listen up, cause these are the directions. Obey what I say, don't complain, I don't wanna hear questions. Follow my lead, time to fall to your knees, it's an order, it's not